Hello. In the Crown of Aragon, 639 years ago, it was March 27th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Molt Cara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Today's document is a letter from Violant to her parents, the Duc de Bar and the Duchess of de Bar. And in previous letters to her parents, Violant has been a little bit more candid than usual. There was one a while ago, I think it was in February, where she said, "Don't believe the rumors about Joan's health, he's fine," admitting that there were rumors. I mean, it could be that she was not being all that candid, because possibly some of the rumors were actually true, and Joan wasn't doing so well health-wise, and she didn't want her parents to know. But at least, she's candid to the extent that she admitted there were rumors. So when I look at a letter from Violant to her parents, I'm looking for opportunities to notice anything as subtle as it might be that might tip off that there's still some problems with Joan's health. And this particular letter doesn't really give me all that much to work with, to be honest. She does use the word convalescence when talking about Joan and his health, but she is continuing to use this very extreme language about how well he's doing. So she mentions that he is plenèrement restitut, like fully recovered, and that he's got perfecta sanitat. He's got perfect health. So, okay, we've got these statements that assert that everything is going just fine with Joan's health, even though we see weird ambiguities and inconsistencies earlier in March. I think the last document that we looked at that was about this way that they're reporting Joan's health condition was on March 22nd. So on the webpage for this document, I'm going to be putting all kinds of links to other episodes in the corroboration section of the webpage. So here we have this letter. It's basically putting in the record that Joan is doing great, health-wise. And I just want to take a moment to give you a heads up about what's coming. Because what I'm really looking for are when cracks begin to show in this narrative about Joan's health being just fine. Because the real drama with his health and his next moment of peril comes in April 27th. And when I say the next moment, what I'm talking about is the existing historiography. So the historians that have identified documents already that talk about Joan's health during this period, as we get into the springtime and approaching summer of 1387, they have already found and written about documents regarding Joan's health and Violant's response to something very serious that happens in late April and into May. I'm going to do a quick rundown of the historians' who have written about this and identified documents in these registers about what happens to Joanne at the end of April. So the first document is April 27th, and Dawn Bratch Prince wrote about it, and it mentions that Joanne is ill. Then we go to a series of documents that Josep Roca wrote about, and those are April 29th, April 30th, and May 4th. And those documents mention a very severe condition that Joanne has. It doesn't specify what's going on, but that he's in bad shape. Then in the folios that are right around the ones that Roca talked about, I found another one. I don't think any historian has written about it yet. It's from May 15th, where there's mention of a grave fever. And then May 25th, there's a document that Rubio y Luch talks about, still talking about how Violant is responding to Joanne's illness. May 27th, there's one by Rodrigo Mateo Lizondo. And then on July 12th, we have a letter that Dawn Bratch Prince discusses, in which Violant is discussing the recovery that Joanne has made. And on July 25th, there's one in the collection by Lizondo about miracles that brought Joanne out of his illness. So we've got this period that is roughly from the end of April through pretty much the entirety of May, in which Joanne is in big trouble health-wise. That's how I'm reading this right now. But what I'm really looking for are indications that something was going wrong earlier in April, and we're now in March 27th, and so we're really on the lookout for this. And then trying to figure out what Joanne was capable of in terms of his normal duties during the month of April, and when he gets into trouble and how long he's out of commission, and then when in May he seems to be back in terms of functioning enough to resume the level of activity that he had and that we see in other moments in the archive. So what's going to be really interesting is to track how what we know, which is that there is some moment where Joanne is not okay, and try to figure out how that shows up in the archive. The moments that Joanne was in big trouble in January, we do see a little bit of a more chaotic representation of a lot of the documents in that late January period, but that overlaps with when they're transitioning into becoming king and queen. So it's really hard to understand what is chaotic in the records because of Joanne's illness and what's chaotic just because of the transition that we're seeing from one reign to another. So this will be interesting to see what I notice in the registers as we move forward. And then there's this other wrinkle, which is that Rafael Tassis y Marca and Josep Roca are making an argument about how some of the letters that we see in the end of April are actually referring to what happened in January. And I'm trying to evaluate that argument and trying to figure out why Roca was making that assertion. Still haven't quite figured that out. I have to go back and read what Roca wrote very carefully. And just to keep in mind that Josep Roca spent a ton of time in these archives and was very masterful in his understanding of all of this material. he was writing in the 1910s and 1920s. I think that his big biography of Joan was 1929, but if you try to read that cover to cover, it's a really tough read because it's almost like sort of what I'm doing with this podcast. He's got a gigantic number of documents that he's trying to weave together, and it's more of like a journal of the documents thematically than it is like what we would expect of a biographical treatment. So, for example, he's got a whole chapter on what he calls Joan's superstitions, things like astrology and other kinds of, Joan getting into what would be called the sidereal, the magic and the health cures that were, maybe what we would think of as less medical and more magical. And so Roca has this whole chapter on what he calls Joan's superstitions, and he basically goes from like beginning to end, like from Joan's entire life, looking at documents about his belief in magic or pursuit of the sidereal. And so he's got these and then he's got another chapter on his Joan's marriages. And so it doesn't read chronologically. And then what's more confusing about this, which would be fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing a work of history like that. But what's confusing is that Roca is inserting a lot of direct quotations from the documents, and he just kind of tends to jump around chronologically a lot. So it's like he made notes about all these documents, and then he's kind of transcribing his notes more than he is pursuing an argument. So it reads more as a notebook than it does as a historical argument. So, I mean, maybe after listening to this podcast, that will feel very comfortable to you. But you also have to be able to read Catalan or have a way to translate the Catalan, which can be kind of tough. Some of that 1920s Catalan is not really the same colloquially as the Catalan writing today. So there's been a couple moments where I've been really tripped up as I'm trying to read what Roca is saying, which is why I can't at this point figure out why he's saying that stuff that's written about Joan's perilous health condition in late April is referring back to January, but it does seem like that is what Roca is saying. All right, so that's what's coming up. That's what we're looking for, and I would say that we've just got this steady drumbeat of Violant saying that Joan's health is good, and she's writing a letter like that almost once a week to somebody, and there's certain moments where she's writing it to everybody. So we have this steady drumbeat about Violant putting out there that Joan is doing well health wise, and what we're going to look for is how she handles it when it's just like really scary for her about, is he going to survive? And I think that we're going to see that in the upcoming weeks. And yeah, I'm just curious about when the first instance is that we'll see that. And if it is something that we're going to notice before the document that Don Bratch Prince identified, which is dated April 27th. So today's letter, we can do a little bit more discussion of it in particular. Violant is writing to her father, and she starts out with this information about some merchants. So in line 3, it's like fourth word from the end of the line, there's mercaders. So there's some kind of, fête dels mercaders, some kind of business of some kind of decision that has to be made. Later on in the letter, about 4 lines down, we see the word decisio del negoci. del dits mercaders. So there's some kind of decision about the business regarding the said merchants, but nothing specific is mentioned here. And then there's also the word justicia, some kind of justice. There's some kind of decision that has to be made about some merchants that somehow her father knows about or has given her information about. Don't know what that is referring to. Maybe we'll see something about that later. The second half of the letter is all about the health of everybody. Violant says, Joanne is convalescing perfectly, everything's great, and then wishes all of her family back in France the best of health. There's some interesting stuff at the bottom of this letter, which is the Latin instruction at the very bottom left, right below the text block, in which we see that the scribe, her, I think, most trusted, consistent scribe, Bartolomeo Servent, has written that there's been another letter that has been sent to the Duchess de Bar, so her mother. So basically what we see here in the second to the last line, I guess you could also say the middle line of that Latin phrase, is mutatis mutandis. And we've seen that before in one of the letters. I think maybe it might have been in one of the Scarampi letters, not sure. But mutatis mutandis is idiomatic for saying that with all the things changed that should be changed. So this is actually a phrase that is still used in legal contexts today in courts in the United States and legal documents. Basically shorthand for saying like the main points are all identical, but we're just changing around some of the smaller details. And it's basically saying like you don't need to have an entirely new copy recorded here, because it's just common sense to understand that when the same letter is being sent out to somebody else, certain necessary details will be changed, such as instead of saying molt car pare, it will probably start molt cara mare or something like that. So that phrase, let's just do a little Latin lesson here, because I think it's really interesting to figure out, well, like how is this phrase operating and how did it go from being a literal phrase, like literally what it would be translated to is something like having been changed, needing to be changed. That's literally what those words are being translated to in their particular tenses. And what's going on grammatically is that this is a construction known as the ablative absolute. The ablative absolute is when you have a noun and a participle in a pairing that is meant to be a separate phrase. So it usually stands alone as a separate clause. And basically it's used to indicate that there is kind of some sort of separation from the other content of a sentence, or maybe that there's some kind of other person doing something. So a noun plus a participle that is separated out from the rest of the sentence, that is an ablative absolute. So the participle part of that is, participle is a grammatical term that means a verb that is acting as an adjective. So in this sense, the ing part of something like needing to be changed, the needing is now an adjective. It's not a verb because it's got the ing. It's in the, when you have the ing, it's the gerundive. So mutandis is the ablative case of a plural gerundive, and it means needing to be changed. Mutatis is an ablative plural, And also, let me just explain the term ablative. The term ablative is the word used in grammar to mean that there's some kind of separate, something is separate or has some kind of separate agent within some clause that's not connected in the direct meaning of the sentence. Is that at all understandable? I'm not sure. But I thought I would just break down mutatis mutandis for you all in case anyone was curious about how Latin works a little bit. And I've probably mangled that explanation. People who really know their Latin, if you're listening to this, I know I messed that up in some places. But it's the general idea here that we have this method in Latin for putting together concepts that in English we would need a prepositional phrase for. We would need something like the word with in order to get the meaning across. But in Latin, you can play with the endings of the words that change based on your tenses and the function grammatically in the sentence. And you can get these fun phrases that are alliterative, fun to say, mutatis mutandis, and they stick around. You know, it's something that's very useful. It's a very shorthand way of saying with the things changed that should be changed. And it's a concept that is useful because it saves you the time of writing a whole new copy in your archival register, if we're talking about this particular document from 1387. And it also saves you time in a contemporary legal context where there's an understanding that we're not going to have to go through painstakingly copies of things when we can just overall say, look, these documents have been changed where they need to be in the small details, but the overall point and meaning is the same. All right, mutatis mutandis. You now know a whole lot about that phrase, and I do too. And let me explain that I didn't just come up with that on my own, all that explanation. Nope. I had the help of good old AI chatbot, ChatGPT. So ChatGPT helped to break down the grammar for me. As I was looking at it, I recalled explanations from some of my Latin teachers, and so it tracked with what I remembered, and so it's not like I was just going to ChatGPT, but in this case, the AI chatbot was a helpful assistant for my memory and my own refreshing of my understanding. One other thing about AI usage for today's episode, I, for the last several episodes, have had the same routine with doing some transcription through Gemini and Claude. But today, on March 27th, Claude was having some problems. It was not able to function. Basically, there's a major outage for Claude on the morning of March 27th, 2026. And so I ran this document through I ran it through Gemini, and I got, some okay transcription, but there's a lot that Gemini didn't quite get. And so basically it was not, I didn't spend much time looking at that. Just checking a couple things. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, like my explanation of Latin grammar might not have really been that great, well, if you still have questions about that, I've done my job. Well, also I'll post the ChatGPT transcript so you can get a better understanding of the ablative absolute and mutatis mutandis from there. Well, okay. Remember, the motto of the Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.